Hi, ladies. It's hard to believe that we're already through the first week of class. I have several things I want to talk to you about this week, but first of all, I want to reiterate some of the expectations for the paper. So you're writing a paper about something to do with the Virgin Mary. It can either be about Marian apparitions, and you can pick one or multiple ones. It could be about a certain Marian devotion, like the history of the Rosary, or it could be about one of the doctrines or teachings about the Virgin Mary, which could be about the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption or the belief that Mary was forever a virgin. And the paper itself needs to be 4 to 6 pages long. This does not include a cover page. You don't need a cover page. If you include one, you will not be, points won't be deducted, but it won't be counted in the 4 to 6 pages. And you need 4 outside sources. Make sure they're reputable. And also make sure that you're writing a formal paper, which means that you don't use any personal pronouns, that you treat the reader like they don't know anything about the topic. And there should be an intro, a body, and a conclusion. So the first line in the paper shouldn't be the subject of your paper. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the Virgin Mary first. And of course, the Virgin Mary was the mother of Jesus. And I think in the Old Testament, the most important woman is Eve. And of course, Eve is kind of attributed with bringing sin into the world. And in the New Testament, we have Mary who kind of redeems that sin by allowing herself to carry the Lord or God in her womb and bring forth the person who can reverse sin. And so Mary, we believe, was a virgin at the time that she conceived Jesus, and that she remained a virgin her entire life. And I know this is something that other Christian denominations don't agree with, partly because there are passages that talk about the brothers and sisters of Jesus, but we as Catholics believe that she was forever a virgin, and that these references either refer to people who were extremely close to Jesus, or were maybe children of Joseph's before he married Mary, or maybe the term is just referring to someone who's so close to them, that they feel like a brother. I think I just said that. But basically there's other explanations for why they might refer to someone as a brother or sister. We also believe in what's called the Immaculate Conception, and people misunderstand this a lot, but the Immaculate Conception is the belief that when Mary was conceived in her mother's womb, her mother's name was Anna, so in Anna's womb when Mary was conceived, that she was born without sin or conceived without sin. And then finally, the Assumption is a belief that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven. And there's some differing kind of takes on this, whether, we're not 100% sure whether she died naturally and then was assumed body and soul into heaven, or she never had a natural death and just as a living person was taken up to heaven. Of course, all other human beings, we believe as Catholics, that their soul could go to heaven, but not their body. And that later we might be reunited with our bodies, but at first, at our death, it's just our souls that would go to heaven. We also say that Mary's the Queen of Heaven, and so she holds a special place in heaven. As Catholics, we do not worship Mary. Some other Christians believe that we do, but we just see her as a person who has a lot of kind of connection with God, and therefore if we ask her to go to God with our prayers, then that might have a little bit of power. That doesn't mean we don't pray directly to God, and it's much like if a friend of yours had a parent who was dying and they asked you to pray for their parent, then you would be an intercessor just like we see Mary. This week you're going to read chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the Bonnie Thurston book, and basically you'll be finishing the book. So in chapter 5, you're going to be reading about Luke. Luke, or whoever wrote the Gospel according to Luke, also wrote the book Acts of the Apostles. And so the two are considered kind of the original book and a sequel, or a 2-volume work, but the two kind of go hand in hand. And the reason that we know they're written by the same person is because they're addressed to the same person. And the Gospel of Luke starts off saying, in this book, I'm going to tell you about all the things that Jesus did. And then in Acts of the Apostles, it basically says, in my first book, I told you everything Jesus did, and now I'm going to tell you about the apostles. And of course, those are paraphrases, but that's the essence of what's said at the beginning of both of these books. So again, they're kind of treated together, and so the book has them, presented together. We know that Luke was a Gentile, the only Gentile author of the New Testament books, that Luke was a doctor, that Luke traveled with St. Paul on Paul's missionary journeys. And beyond that, we don't know much about Luke. Luke does offer us some new insight into the second coming of Jesus, also known as the Parousia. And it's in his gospel that it's clear that this will happen much later. In Mark's gospel, it seems like that second coming will be any day. But by the time Luke wrote his gospel, or whoever wrote the gospel of Luke, it's clear to them that the Parousia, or second coming, will be delayed. Another thing that's kind of interesting, looking at the gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, is that the gospel of Luke really focuses on women. Sometimes it's called the gospel of women. A third of the people who are mentioned by name in this gospel are women, and 10 out of 45 or something like that of the unnamed people are also women. So there's far more women in this gospel than any other. With that being said, in the gospel, the women kind of stand out as being people who make their own choices, and they're kind of countercultural choices. But when Acts of the Apostles is written, it's clear that because of the delayed second coming of Jesus, that Luke realizes that Christians have to kind of fit into Roman society. And so the women in the Acts of the Apostles are much more subdued and seem much less like rabble-rousers or people that are looking to change the system. You're also going to read chapter 6, which is about the deuterocanonical letters. These would go back to letters written by Paul, and I just want to remind you that this book is organized in the order the books were written, not in the order they appear in the Bible. And that's why you read first about the Pauline letters, the genuine ones, and then later about these deuterocanonical ones, because they were written later. Essentially, there's many different types of letters that Paul is given credit for writing. Some are called the genuine Pauline letters. We think Paul actually wrote these. Some are called pseudonymous letters. This means that whoever wrote them, the anonymous person, used Paul's name as their pseudonym or their fake name. There are some letters that are called disputed letters. These letters, theologians don't really agree on, meaning which category they should go in. There are some that are called captivity letters. This means Paul wrote them, or whoever wrote them were imprisoned when they wrote them. And there are what's called pastoral letters, and these letters were written to heads of churches, giving them advice on how to pastor the church. And finally, there's a set of letters that are known as the Catholic letters. They're calling this because the word Catholic with a lowercase means universal, and these letters are written to the whole church. And these letters do not claim Paul as their author, and they are actually named after the person who wrote them. So a big question with these letters is, if the letter wasn't actually written by Paul, if it's not a genuine letter, then should we give it as much credibility as we would a letter that we know Paul wrote? A lot of the passages in the Bible that suggest things that might be considered sexist about women today come from these deuterocanonical books. So if we don't give them as much credibility as, say, the genuine letters, then that kind of takes out some of the messages that were somewhat sexist toward women. And I do want to remind you, in my last video I talked about this, but we should always be asking ourselves when it comes to the Bible, is this passage prescriptive or descriptive? Was it intended to describe how things were, or was it intended to prescribe how things should be? And so again, with these letters, we never know for sure if Paul was simply being descriptive or if he was being prescriptive. Chapter 7 in the textbook is kind of like a summary, some final thoughts. I don't have a PowerPoint for chapter 7 because it's pretty short, and it's again basically summing up Bonnie Thurston's thoughts about women and how they're portrayed in the Bible. There is a discussion this week too, so please make sure to turn things in on time, and I look forward to reading your papers.